Hello. Well, my friends at Battelle, what a privilege to be able to speak to you today. I'm in sunny Belfast and we're in the 8th week of lockdown, but the Word of God is still alive and sharp and cuts between the soul and the spirit of men and women. So we're going to look at the Word of God today. I'm going to talk to you from the book of Daniel. It's in the Old Testament, and Daniel chapter 1 in particular. Now, rather than read the whole chapter, I'll highlight verses as we go along, particularly towards the end, but I'll tell you the story. The year is 605 BC, so it's over 2,500 years ago. Israel is besieged, Jerusalem in particular, is besieged by a foreign power, the Babylonians, headed by a man, the king Nebuchadnezzar. Eventually the city has to give way to his forces. The city is destroyed, all the valuable articles are taken out, but more importantly, many of the citizens are taken captive on a 16 to 1700 mile journey across the desert to go and live in Babylon. And his purpose isn't to kill them all, but he wants to take the cream of the crop and use them in his civil service, among whom are 4 young men. Now, their names are changed. One you will recognise, he's called Daniel, that's his old name. But the other 3, their new names are Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. So Daniel's new name was Belteshazzar. And they're taken in, and they're only young men. We reckon they're maybe 16, 17. And it says they're obviously of royal, noble blood, and they're good-looking guys, intelligent. So they're taken into the king's civil service to be trained, to be used by him. So they settle down amongst a whole group of other people, and eventually, when the food comes, they realise it's not kosher. In other words, it's not prepared according to the Jewish laws. So Daniel says, we can't eat that. And the man put in charge of them, he takes a liking to these guys, and he says, look, if you don't put on weight and look well at the end of this time, the king's going to have my head. And Daniel says, well, let's have a test. Let us only eat vegetables and drink water for 10 days and see what happens. At the end of the 10 days, they look better, sharper, healthier, fitter than any of the other young men. So they're able to eat their own food. They make a choice very wisely. At the end of the 2 years, when they're in their apprenticeship, they come and they're questioned by the king himself. And it says that Daniel and his 3 friends were found more intelligent, had more learning, more understanding than all of the rest of them. That's essentially chapter 1 in the book of Daniel. Now, I've called this talk today, living in a second choice world, because no matter how favourable their circumstances were, effectively they're prisoners in a foreign land. Effectively, they've been taken to a place they don't want to be. So they're living what we call a second choice world. Now, I don't know if you ever remember the band Boney M. Anybody who's been around the 80s remember Boney M. And they had this incredible song, and it was by the rivers of Babylon, and it's a straight lift from Psalm 137. And the context is that it kind of encapsulates what this is all about, because the Jewish believers, the people from Israel, the captives are there, and the local people say to them, give us a song from the old country. And it says, we threw our harps on the tree. They threw them out the window, and they said this, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And the big question for us is can we sing God's song in a strange land, in a place that maybe we don't want to be? Maybe through no fault of our own we find ourselves in the situation we're in. Is it possible to find God there as much as you found him in your Jerusalem or your favourable land? A couple of things going on. Number one, in the old days, in ancient days, that when your country was defeated by another country, the implication was just not a political and geographical. In other words, our army is better than yours. It had an implication for your God. They believed that therefore it meant if you were beaten, that their gods were stronger than your gods. So in the minds of the people of Israel were this, has God lost his power? Has God lost his power? How could they trust a God who had allowed them to be defeated? Could they be blessed outside the land of Israel? There was also the threat of assimilation. Remember, the king's aim is not to crush them, but to win them to his worldview. The question is, would they become just like the people they'd been sent to live among? Or could they retain their distinctiveness in the middle of all their suffering? And the other thing is, of course, in Jewish terms, God's blessing was determined by being in a particular place. That is the land of Israel. I mean, even when the people of Israel, or the Jewish people, were in Egypt, they were the right people. They just weren't the right people in the right place. So this is the very first time the people of Israel have to discover for themselves that God can be discovered and known outside of the promised land. Daniel becomes the leader. He dares to say no at a very young age. And the wonderful thing is this, I love this, his faithfulness spans over 70 years. His faithfulness spans over 70 years. The book of Daniel is his life story. And I think we come to the conclusion at this, if Daniel can find God in his Babylon, the place where he doesn't want to be, then there's nowhere that God isn't at work. And it doesn't matter where you find yourself today, what's going on in your past, God is at work wherever you are, whatever you've done. Now, one of the things that theologians have discovered, they've tried to put on this, and I think it's really important, is that the book of Daniel is seen as a contrast between two places. And we're going to look at that today. So the contrast between Jerusalem and Babylon, both in the macro and the micro, and I'll explain that. So let's take Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a place that you want to be, where you feel comfortable. The people are like you. They speak the same language. They eat the same food. They support the same football team. They think the same. They've got the same religion. You feel comfortable and happy. But Babylon's an alien place. You're not at home there. Why? Because the people aren't like you. They don't share your values. They don't talk the same language. In fact, they think you're a bit weird, actually. And in one sense, of course, Christians today live in Babylon. We live in a place, this world, there's an old hymn that says, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. And there's a real truth to that, actually, that the world in which we live is an alien place. And sometimes we find ourselves in a place that we don't actually want to be. That's on the macro. But on the micro, on our personal lives, it's also true that we find ourselves in situations that we'd rather not be in. Sometimes it's our fault, but actually lots of times where it's because of nothing that we've done. It just actually happens to you. And in the West, we have an expectation and a hope that we will have the freedom to choose. You know, we choose our job, our wives, our husbands, our language, our food, the places we live, our company we keep, everything about it. And Daniel, by contrast, is an example of a second choice world. He's carted off to a place that he doesn't want to be. He has to relate to a people he doesn't understand. He has to learn their language. He doesn't like the food. We got it. He doesn't worship their gods. And he's never in control of his own destiny. And I think that life is much more like that than we care to admit. In other words, at some stage in our life, we find ourselves in a place where we don't actually want to be. My Jerusalem centres on family, and I guarantee you loads. Some of us have got bad memories, some of us have got really good memories. And my mum and dad had a difficult relationship. And when I was just coming up to 16, my father called my sister and I in with my mother and said, your mum and I are splitting up. And suddenly I was in a second choice world, a place I didn't want to be. It wasn't a place that I had contributed to. It was just something that was foisted upon me. And actually, one phone call, a couple of bad decisions, you can find yourself in a place that you don't want to be. I saw my father twice in 2 years and once in the next 36 years. And life was never the same again. It affected me, and it's affected me the whole of my life. And then I saw Jerusalem, my promised land. What was that? I met Priscilla. She was 14, I was 16. And it was, love at first sight. And I remember, we were allowed to stay out. She was allowed to stay out to 10:30 at night. And after a couple of weeks, the mum and dad wanted to meet me. So we went out in their little Morris Minor car with Priscilla's younger sister and brother. No seatbelts. And they sang Christian choruses. And I remember coming home and crying. Because I thought, why couldn't I have been born into a family like that? Now, of course, they had their own issues as well. But it was an example that there was something that was different than I'd ever experienced before. And I looked on it as Jerusalem, but I lived in Babylon. And sometimes you have to go, can I find God in Babylon, in a place that I don't actually want to be? All of us have first world fantasies, don't we? I have a few. Leeds United going to win the Champions League in a couple of years when they get back into the Premiership, which I hope will be next season. And there's things that you think about. But I think there are some Christian fantasies that we live with sometimes. And they go something like this: it's only in my second choice world that I'll be able to follow God. Do you understand? So in other words, if everything's right in my life, and I beat my bad habits, I beat my addictions, I've got plenty of money, I'm happily married, I've got a good job, if that was all true, then I might be able to follow God. It's absolute nonsense. Some of the best Christians I've ever met had the most difficult circumstances. And the book of Daniel shows us this one thing: it doesn't matter what world you live in. You can be in a place that not of your own choosing, and it's the most difficult, and you can still find and follow God. In fact, it's not just about survival, it's about thriving. I find that people who have the most difficult circumstances thrive. Paul in Acts 16, he's in prison. They've been badly flogged. They're in stocks. They've been beaten. They've been mistreated. What do you find them complaining and going, this isn't fair? No, it says at midnight they're singing and they're praying and people are listening. So please, it doesn't matter where you find yourself. You can find God. There is another one as well. And it's, in one sense, the flip side of that. And the other side of it is this: if I was a good enough Christian, and if I followed all the rules, and I read my Bible regularly, and I prayed enough, and I was a really good Christian, then God would give me all the things that I really want. And so it's almost a sense of, if I shape up, I'll get a reward, and I'm in Babylon, but if I shape up and I do what's right, God will make all these things right in my life. Actually, Daniel was a man who had a relationship with God, followed him through thick and thin, wouldn't bow down to the king, refused to be won over to his worldview, refused to be seduced to the worldview of the country in which he was living in. And he never got back to Jerusalem. There's no record that Daniel ever got back. Now, it was actually 70 years under a man called, wait for it, Zerubbabel, that the children of Israel started to drift back again. You read about that in the book of Nehemiah and Ezra. But Daniel never got back again. And yet he maintained his faithfulness to God. And so, please, don't say, if I become a good enough Christian, all these good things will happen to me. The reality is that whatever world you find yourself in, you can know and find and prove God. I live in Babylon. Our society is not Jerusalem, in the sense that the laws of our land don't support our faith anymore. Sometimes your work environment is a very difficult place, and you find yourself in a place you don't want to be. And without labouring it too much, I'm sure some of you feel that. I don't want to be in the place that I'm in today. The wonderful thing about this is that you can find God in the middle of your second choice world. He doesn't just show up when conditions are right. And you can engage with the world You can be a prophetic voice in society, and that's the message of Daniel. Doesn't matter what your world is, doesn't matter what's happened in your life. You can be in a second choice world, and to be honest with you, and this isn't a prophetic word, but it is descriptive. All of us at some stage in our life will go through a period when we think, goodness, I wish I wasn't doing this here. I wish my life wasn't like this. But the wonderful thing is that you can find God in the middle of it. Let me give you some pointers that might help us on our journey in our second choice world from the book of Daniel. Number one, sometimes a second choice world begins with disobedience. Verse 2 says, and the Lord delivered them. Why? Because they were idolatrous and disobedient to God. And I don't want to labour on this one, but I do want to make it clear that if it is your fault that you find yourself where you are in your second choice world, then it's good to admit it. Now Daniel is an example of the opposite. He's there. Now he has to take corporate responsibility because he was part of it. But nonetheless, it was the ruling elite that had led them into idolatry. The people had gone for it, of course. There's no question about that. But they're there because of some of the choices that they had made in life. And sometimes our second choice world result from the failures, initiatives, stupidities and decision making of others. But if it's us, and it's really good to admit it, I found in my life that there's grace and there's mercy. Mercy is you don't get what you do deserve, which is judgment. And grace is you do get what you don't deserve, which is the blessing and favour of God. There's lots of that around for people who, before God, will put their hand up and go, hello, I'm here today because of my stupid decisions. There were extenuating circumstances, but I'm not making that as an excuse. I made some really bad choices, and I'm here today because of that. And if that's the case, wow, when you come to that point where you realise, actually, I'm in Babylon because of some of the things that I've done, and you admit that, it opens up this incredible reservoir of God's favour and God's love in your life. There's no end to the forgiveness and mercy at the hand of God for those who, when they're there because of their own choice, put their hands up. So sometimes it begins with disobedience. Number two, second choice world can be a place of renewal and discovery. And the Bible is one of the great themes of Scripture is learning through loss. In other words, Daniel, let's take Daniel. Daniel discovered stuff about himself that he never would have discovered if he'd continued to live in Jerusalem. In other words, it was a different set of circumstances that he was exposed to that began to challenge him in his thinking and put some courage and character into his life. And he discovered things about God that he never would have realized. He had to trust God in new ways. A bit like this COVID-19. It's thrown us all a curveball. We're having to trust God in new ways that we sort of thought, well, I do this, the money comes in. That for many people, that's not happening now. So for Christians, we've got to go, okay, we learned something new about the character of God and trusting God. And so learning through loss can be a place of renewal in your own life and discovery of who God is and who you are. And Daniel finds God in exile, and he proves God in an alien culture, and he discovers that even when you're in the worst place, Babylon, God can be known, experienced and honoured. It's 21 years ago, almost exactly. I was in Brazil, an awful lot of coffee there, and I was preaching and doing a camp out in the countryside, and I got bitten by an insect, and I got a disease called dengue fever. It's a tropical illness, a bit like malaria, only worse. That's what I tell people. 10% of people die from it. So I was pretty ill when I was there. I mean, actually, I was really ill when I was there. And one of the things that happens is you've got a very high temperature, and you're basically about 3 days of it, of that sick period, you don't know where you are. As somebody said, I was delirious for 3 days, and my wife says nobody noticed for those 3 days that I was delirious because anyway, I'm always talking junk. And so anyway, I was really ill, and when I eventually got home, and took a bit of while to recover. And when I was at home, a doctor came to see me, a doctor of tropical medicine out of our church. He used to work in Africa. And he said, Paul, one of the side effects of dengue is depression. And I advise you to take 6 months off and cancel all your engagements and just batten down the hatches. It's a chemical reaction, it's blood cells, etc. And of course I promptly ignored him, and after 2 months fell off the edge of a cliff. Never been depressed in my life before, but began to discover what it was that, just I think when we get down as human beings, we've all got little triggers that help us get back up again. For some of us it's a fridge full of Mars bars, but they say, there's things that will pick you up, but they say with depression, you put your hand up to turn the light switch on, that'll help you, but you can't find the light switch. And I'd experienced something at 21 years ago at the age of 47 that I'd never experienced before. I'm a big football fan. A number of you will know that. Season ticket holder at one of my local clubs, Linfield. Obviously I'd been off for quite a while, and when I come back, I sit with the same group of guys, most of them not Christians, but we've all got to know each other over the years. We're pals, and that they know who I am. I was the pastor of a pretty large church in Belfast, so I was a big fish in a small pond. And two of my friends said, I heard you haven't been well, Paul. And I said, yeah, I've had dengue fever, and actually I've been a bit depressed. Total silence, didn't know what to say. Two guys weren't Christians. 2 weeks later, next home game, they said to me, Paul, can we talk to you? And they said this, Paul, when you said that you'd been depressed, we thought for the first time in our lives, if you can be depressed and be a Christian, maybe we could be Christians. And I thought to myself, it was just like light opening. And I thought, these guys, I've talked to them about Christ. I've told them about my faith. I've talked to them about all the things that Christianity does for you. But actually, they identify more with me in my brokenness than they do in my victory. And I learned something that day, that our world is a very broken place. And sometimes when they see broken, equally broken people whose lives have been handed over to Jesus on the mend, it's an incredible testimony. They identify with us in our brokenness even more than in our victory. Please don't be afraid to speak about your brokenness. We're all broken people. That's why we build broken things. I'm a broken person who's being healed by Jesus. And with all the stuff that's going on in my life with my father, I won't be whole this side of heaven, but I'm absolutely believing that God has done something in me. But I was a broken person, and they identified in it. So second choice worlds can be a place of learning and discovery about yourself and about God. Number 3, which you find is going through second choice world with your friends. Quite a number of times in the passage, if you read Daniel 1, it mentions the friends, just keeps going. It's an oral tradition that's been written down. So every time they mention the friends, they don't say Daniel and his mates. They say Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and they go over it. And actually, second choice worlds, I believe it's very hard to get through it on your own. If we're going to be successful, we can't do it on our own. I need a group of people who've been there before me, and it'll help me through what I'm going through. And that's why I believe in church and community. That's why Battelle is so incredible, so fantastic. You've got a group of people who've been through this before you. And people rarely transform their lives on their own. The tendency in our world is to see independence as a strength. But in reality, it's the group of people who have resolved to stand together that make a difference. And that's why I believe in the local church. And there's something very powerful about friends going through. Could I just say to you, there was a time in Priscilla in my life, I was a Christian pastor, full-time in Christian work. And we went through something with a couple of our own family. And it was the worst, honestly. With all that I've told you about my dad and dengue fever, nothing compared to what we went through. If I told you the story, honestly, it was just awful. We would not have got through it, the impact it had on our lives, without the people who we call our friends, who loved us, stood with us, did not try and give us any helpful advice at times, but they pointed us to Jesus. and kept encouraging us and praying for us and being there and loving us. Wow, how incredible to be part of a life-giving community. We got to go through it with friends. Don't despise that. Don't despise that. Stick with those friends and they'll stick with you all the time. Number 5, choose wisely in your second choice world. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Daniel, he gets his names changed. That's the first thing they do. They change their names. And Daniel goes from Daniel to Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar means may Baal be praised. That is one of their foreign gods. So he's basically being, Satan's a great guy. Put that in your head. But so he accepts that, but he won't give way on the food. I found in my life, you got to make choices, the right choices, make them early, draw a line in the sand early. I became a Christian. My dad had left home, hadn't seen him for a while, and a great uncle invited me to some Christian meetings, and I came along, and 3 nights later I gave my life to Christ. And I don't know why, nobody ever told me, but the next day I went into school. We always went for a smoke before assembly, a wee crowd of us. And as soon as we got there, I stood up on one of the wee benches and I said, guys, something to tell you. I have given my life to Jesus Christ, and I'm going to be a different person. I have, and I did my best as a 16-year-old who was a broken young man to tell him about Jesus. And all the guys, nobody said anything, no banter, no crack, everybody filtered out. And one of the guys came back and he said, Reid, he said, listen, don't tell anybody I said this, but he said, you've done the right thing. I just wish we had the courage to do it as well. Can I say, gentlemen, when you say yes to Jesus, put the flag up. Put your hand up. Draw a line in the sand. Commitment actually is really important. Taking that stand. And when you say things, even into yourself, God takes you really seriously. And so I would say, choose wisely in your life. Make decisions about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do early on. And say, this might be difficult, but I'm going to choose to walk and to do the right thing. I'm going to listen to advice. I'm going to go for God. And I'm going to find God in my second choice world. And number 5 is that a relationship with a living God. It says of these young men in verse 17 that God gave them wisdom and understanding. Now in Scripture, wisdom and understanding are not just in the conventional sense of things, that you've got a bit of intelligence. They're about a relationship with a living God. And just a little bit of history. 2 kings before King Jehoiakim, the one who was away, just a few years before, when these young men would have been early teens, there was a king called Josiah, and they'd had a revival. They discovered the scriptures in the temple and they read them, and they had a revival in Israel. Within a few short years, people turned their backs, but these young men were exposed to that. And what did they get out of it? A living relationship with God. It was the one thing that was going to sustain them for the rest of their lives. They had a living relationship with a living God. And so today, if I'm gonna get our way, find our way out of our second choice world, whatever that is, the primary thing that we need is a relationship with a living God. And the fact that Jesus is God, it means that we use terminology, but basically we say yes to him. We commit our lives to him. We say, Lord, look, when you died on the cross, you forgave my sins, and I want to receive that. I want to believe that you did that for me. And when you do that, something happens. A transaction happens. You're forgiven. You're brought into the family of God. And life begins to change. It changes over time as you submit yourself on a daily basis to God. But you make that initial decision. I'm going to enter in to a relationship with Jesus. You might want to pray inwardly yourself today. Jesus, thank you for dying for me. Thank you that when you died on the cross, you took my sins. And I say yes to you today and invite you into my heart. Thank you, Jesus, for saving me. Well, God bless you for the rest of this lockdown. We're all in a second choice world in the sense that we don't want to be locked down. But the good thing is we can all find God in our second choice world. God bless you all. Hope to see you soon.